Shevuot Daf Yomi Aleph, Contextual Interpretation במסרבין לאכול. When we learned Masechta Nedarim, because we have two Masechtas that deal with oaths, Masechta Nedarim and Masechta Shevuot, which we're learning at the moment. When we learned Masechta Nedarim, we spoke a lot about what happens when there seems to be a tension between what a person says and what the context implies. So the words a person uses in matters of Nedarim and Shevuot are very important. The precise meaning of the words are very, very important. But they're important as an expression of intent. And sometimes the context in which the words are pronounced indicate that the intent isn't quite what the words sound like. So to what extent do we look at the context in order to interpret the words of the individual? And that's part of the discussion that takes place here. And we'll learn from Abaye that context can be an important factor in interpreting a shvuah, interpreting a person's intent, but we'll get quite granular as to what aspects of context to use and how to use context. And in the process, I'll introduce you to the Radvaz, who plays an important part in today's shiur. You know, sometimes when you're learning, you get to a conclusion that is above your pay grade. That you get to a conclusion, you say, but if I'm right, then what do I do with, in this case, it was the Tur, a Shulchan Aruch, that seems to learn not the way I learned. So normally what you do is at that point you give up. If the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch doesn't learn the way you've learned, the chances are pretty good that you haven't learned right. But occasionally you find a big brother to support you. Somebody who knew the Shulchan Aruch, a friend of the Shulchan Aruch. And he tells you, don't worry so much, don't worry about the Shulchan Aruch, you're on the right track. That's very exciting when that happens. And today was such a case. The Radvaz is an incredibly important character in the development of Torah and of Halakha. He, as a child, was in Spain. He was part of the expulsion from Spain, lands up in Eretz Yisrael, spends time in Yerushalayim, and eventually goes to Egypt, to Cairo, where he becomes the Godel Hador. In Cairo, he's the chief rabbi of Cairo, the Dayan, the Rosh Yeshiva, the Av Beis Din of Cairo. In Cairo, he's the Rebbe of the Shita Mekubetzes that we use throughout Shas. He's the Rebbe of the Ari. The Arizal used to be a Talmud in his yeshiva in Cairo. He was a big Mekubal himself. He understood Kabbalah and he knew Kabbalah. But he was one of the first people who laid down the principle, because at that time the Zohar was becoming popular and well known, and he laid down the principle that when there's a machlokes between Shas, Bavli and Yerushalmi, and the Sifrei Kabbalah, the books of Kabbalah, including the Zohar, if there's a difference of opinion, he will always paskin like the Gemara. And he says, and I will pay no attention to what the Sifrei Kabbalah say if the Gemara says something different. And that's been the method of the Ashkenazi method of Psak all the way to the Vilna Gaon and subsequently to follow that. He says, if in Divrei Kabbalah, what they say in Kabbalah is lechumra, if there's something in Kabbalah that takes a more severe view than we take in Shas, then personally I would keep that chumra, but I wouldn't impose it on other people. And if it's not lechumra, I certainly wouldn't pay attention. Generally, he tries to find the easier way out. When people are suffering with a dilemma created by a halacha that makes their life difficult, he usually tries to find a way out, a way to resolve the halachic issue, and he wrote thousands of tshuvot, literally, the Radvaz. He wrote a very important one about the Ethiopians in that time already, about the Falashas as they were known at that time, holding that they were Jewish, but that wasn't a good thing for them. Because if they were Jewish all the time, then he said they're questions of mamzerut. They weren't keeping to all the laws, all the details of the laws of Gittin and Kiddushin, and therefore they were questions of mamzerut. It would have been easier for them had he decided that they were not Jewish, and then they could be converted, and that would be the end of the story. But being Sofek Mamzerim made it very difficult for them. He got involved in some very controversial issues and led the way in halakha. Later on, he comes to Yerushalayim. By the way, he's an enormously wealthy person. He's an international trader, in wheat and in hides, well known in the business world throughout the world. Eventually comes to Yerushalayim and finds it too intense. He just finds Yerushalayim is intense. There's a lot going on. The government at the time wanted to tax him like crazy, and he just felt very uncomfortable in Yerushalayim. So he went to Tzfat. And that's where he became friendly with the Mechaber, with the Shulchan Aruch, who was an old man at that time. And all the great people of Tzfat at that time, the Radvaz was part of that group. So when the Radvaz came to learn with me today, it was an enormous relief, because I was struggling with the Shulchan Aruch, with the Beis Yosef himself, with Rabbi Yosef Karo. And I can't struggle with him. I'm just nothing. I felt crushed. And the Radvaz came in and said, don't worry, you're onto something. You don't have to be intimidated by my friend Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Shulchan Aruch. We can have a look at this. Let's see what that's all about. So the Gemara is based on the first Mishnah in the third parak of Shavuos, that it seems clear from the Mishnah that when a person says, I swear, I make a shvua she'ochal, that I will eat with you, that he means I will eat. That's what he means. But the Gemara then brings a proof from Masechta Nedarim, where there's a case where a person says just those words, I will eat with you, and it means the opposite, I will not eat with you. Says Abaye, the difference is context. If a person just says, I will eat with you, that means I will eat with you. But the difference is, kan b'mesarvin bo le'echol, kan b'she'en mesarvin bo le'echol. The difference is when somebody is trying to persuade him to accept an invitation. Please come to me for Shabbos. Please come for me for meal. Please come. And he keeps on saying, no, I'm busy. I've got other things on. And that's the difference. He says this brisa is b'mesarvin bo le'echol v'ka'amar lo achilna v'lo achilna. He says, no, I'm sorry, I can't join you. I can't. He tries again and he says, I can't join you for dinner. And so it goes on. And eventually he says, eventually he says, I make a shvua about eating with you. What he means is not I make a shvua that I will eat with you, what he means is, if I eat to you, that should be forbidden to me like a shvua. I can't eat with you. I'm making it impossible to eat with you, so get off my back. That's the end of it. That's how Abaye explains the Gemara. Rav Ashi learns it differently. And Rav Ashi says, clearly, if a person says, I will eat with you, it means just that. It means I will eat with you. Says the Tur, if he says, I swear I will eat with you, it doesn't matter if he was trying to persuade him or he wasn't trying to persuade him. The context is not important. If the man says, I swear I will eat with you, then he's obligated to eat with him. Or he says, I swear I won't eat with you, it means I won't eat with you. And he says, V'harambam katav, but the Rambam wrote, Im hiftzir bo sheyochal imo v'amar shvua sheyochal lecha asur le'echol imo. The Rambam says, even if he was persuading him to eat with him, and he says, shvua sheyochal lecha, I'm making a shvua about eating with you, asur le'echol imo. Although the words he used was, I will eat with you, clearly the intention is, I will not eat with you. And we go by the intention. But the Rosh paskins against the Rambam, and he paskins like the Tur says himself, and other Rishonim, that the context is not important. Chadis read the Shulchan Aruch paskin exactly that way. He says, a person says, I swear I will eat with you. That is an oath that he will eat with him. And it makes no difference if there was an attempt to persuade or there wasn't, if there was a discussion, a conversation going on contextually, that doesn't matter. And then he says, and there is somebody who says, there's somebody who says, if there was an attempt to persuade him, and he said, what he really means is, I'm not going to eat with you, because the context determines the meaning, and that's the understanding of the context. Who is that? That's clearly the Rambam. So if you look in the Be'er HaGolah, who attributes sources to all the different paragraphs of the Shulchan Aruch, he says the first statement of the Shulchan Aruch comes from our Mishnah on Daf Yotes Amud Beis. And the Shulchan Aruch paskins like Rav Ashi, the final view where Rav Ashi says you don't look at context, you just look at the words. And the Vilna Gaon says because Rav Ashi is the end of the period of the Gemara, he's the last authority. But the other view is the Rambam, says the Be'er HaGolah, that's the Rambam, who paskins like Abaye, because Rav Ashi, if you go like Rav Ashi, you have to change the wording in the Mishnah, it's very complicated. And the Rambam prefers to go with Abaye. But look at the words in the Rambam. Let's get to the Rambam itself. If the Rambam is the source of the second view, Says the Rambam, or if he was persuading him to eat with him. Sometimes people can be very continuous, please come, invitation after invitation after invitation, and he keeps on turning down the invitation, and this person isn't getting the hint. Then the Rambam adds, V'hu nimna v'nishba v'amar shvua shochelo, and he declines and says, Shvua, I swear about eating with you. Kol eilu asurim v'arei nishba shelo yochel etzlo. In such a case, that what he actually means is, I'm making a shvua, I will not eat with you. Although the words I used were, I will eat with you, what I meant was, I'm making a shvua about eating with you, and the shvua is, I won't eat with you. The oath is, I won't eat with you. You interpret it that way because of the context. But the Rambam adds two words into the context, which the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch conveniently ignore. The Rambam says, V'hu nimna. He is refusing the invitation. When the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch quote the Rambam, they leave that word out. He says, please join me, and he persuades and persuades, and the answer of the other person is, on my life, I will, by shvua, I'm going to eat with you. And they just leave out the v'hu nimna. Where does the Rambam get the v'hu nimna from, and he declines? Because the Gemara says that. The Gemara says very clearly, V'ko'amar, and he says, after being persuaded and invited, he says, Lo achilna, v'lo achilna. Again and again he says, no, I won't join you for dinner. And the person persists and continues. So the Rambam takes it right from the Gemara itself, from the words of Abaye, where Abaye is explaining this. We're talking in a case where he says, no. And the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch seem to think that that's not important. It's just describing the situation. What's important is that he says the shvua by a shvua. And if you look at the whole context, he's using the shvua to make it very clear that this is over. No more discussion about coming. And they leave out this lo achilna, but the Rambam doesn't leave it out. And I found that there's a Teres Chaim is an interesting sefer on shvuas. Teres Chaim is about 16th century in Eastern Europe, and the Rabbi Avram Chaim Shor was a Talmud of the Maharsha, a very important person. His father was a Talmud of the Ramah. So they're at the time of the Shulchan Aruch. They're just after the time of the Shulchan Aruch itself. And he's disturbed by what the Shulchan Aruch does. And he wants to say, maybe there's a misprint, and you've got to add the word in there, actually. Perhaps you've got to add that in. Since they're basing it on the Rambam, surely you've got to use the words of the Rambam, which they somehow ignored. And maybe there's just a misprint. They left some printer left the words out. But that doesn't seem likely, because the Shulchan Aruch is quoting from the Torah. This is not just the Shulchan Aruch himself. The Shulchan Aruch is quoting from the Torah. The Torah already misquotes the Rambam, so to say. And he says, maybe the Shulchan Aruch figures you don't have to say that he declines, because it says hiftzir, he's persuading him. You only have to persuade somebody who's declining. You don't have to persuade somebody who accepts your first invitation. So maybe the Shulchan Aruch doesn't need to say that. But I find that difficult as well, because it's so key. What the Rambam says is so key to understanding the whole principle. Why would you leave out the most important words? So then I found the Radvaz, and I've explained to you who the Radvaz is. The Radvaz wants to say, I hold the Rosh and the Rambam aren't even arguing. They're talking about two different cases. The Rambam is talking about a case where he's nimna, where he refuses the invitation, and the Rosh is talking about a case where he doesn't refuse the invitation. The Shulchan Aruch turns us into two separate views and paskins like the first view. He paskins like his father, the Rosh. But the Radvaz has the shoulders to say that I think the Shulchan Aruch and the Torah have made a mistake here. They haven't understood the Rambam. In glossing over those words, v'hu nimna, they've lost the very essence of what the Rambam intends. The Rambam agrees with the Rosh that if he doesn't expressly decline, simply the man says, come to me for dinner. He says again, come to me for dinner. And he says, a shvua sheichel, I'm making a shvua about eating with you. That means I'm not coming. That's what we would have thought. No, says the Radvaz. Everybody agrees that if he just says a shvua sheichel, you take the words as they are. I'm making a shvua that I will come. The only time you can use the context is when the context is one of his own behavior. It's not just looking at what's happening around you. So we're zooming in context. Sometimes you just look at the context and you say, if I look at the context of what's happening, I have a different interpretation of the man's words and what his intention is. That's not what Abaye is saying. That's not good enough in Shavuos. Abaye is saying, you've got to look at the context of the man's behavior just before he utters the oath. And his behavior is vehu nimna. He is saying, no, thank you. He is saying, I'm not coming. He is not responding to the texts and the emails. He's very clearly giving a message, I don't want to be with you, I don't want to have dinner with you. So when he makes his shvuah, you can't interpret the shvuah against his own behavior. That's the importance of the Rambam, says the Radvaz. It's not just a question of general context. If it was general context, then the way the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch understand the Gemara is okay, one can live with it. But if you understand what the Rambam is, Machadish is what the Rambam introduces here, is that the Gemara is teaching us this is not about general context, this is about the behavior of the individual who's making the shvuah. And if he's behaved in a way that clearly indicates his desire not to eat with the person inviting him, then you've got to interpret the shvuah that way. And that the Rosh would agree with that. It's not even a machlokes Rambam and Rosh. According to the Radvaz, very, very bold, going right against, and I say he's one of that group of people. He knew the Shulchan Aruch. He was in Tzfat at the time of Rabbi Yosef Karo. He's a colleague. He can say this kind of thing. He, with his brilliance and vast knowledge and understanding of Shas and Poskim, can go through the Rambam, and he can say the way I've learned the Rambam is different from the way the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch have learned the Rambam. There's a very interesting halacha to conclude, where the Gemara says you can't invite somebody to dinner if you know they won't come, because it looks like you get credit for something you don't intend. Please join me for dinner. You know they're not going to come. And that way, at least you've kind of got the credit of I've issued an invitation. That's Gnei Vastas. You're actually misleading somebody. You don't want them to come. You have no intention of their coming. So the question is really, how is this person going on and on, inviting him and inviting him? But the Shulchan Aruch says there's an interesting thing, that if a person does something and it's obvious what his intention is, that it's not for him. So this is where we have the halach in Chesed Mishpat, Siman Reish Kaf Ches. You can't walk into a store and pretend to be interested when you have no intentions of buying. You've got to tell the store owner, I would like to look around, but I'm not ready to buy. You've got to make that clear. But, says the Shulchan Aruch, if it's obvious that what your intention is, then you don't have to express it. You don't have to say it. If you're standing up, a great Rosh Yeshiva walks into the shul and you stand up, and at the same time the shamus is walking in, and the shamus thinks you've stood up for him, you don't have to say, I wasn't standing for you, I was standing for him. Because if you look at the situation, you can see that that's what it was. Adds the sma, there are times when you do invite a person who you know won't join. Look at the sensitivity of the Torah of halacha. And that's a case where if you don't invite him, others will make assumptions. We talked yesterday about making assumptions. If I invite you, although I have no intention of entertaining you, that's Gnei Vadat, because the other person is assuming that you intend, that you would like to have him for dinner. The truth is you don't want to have him for dinner. The last thing you want is for him to accept the invitation, but you know you're safe, he won't accept the invitation. So it's Gnei Vadat, you're not allowed to do that. But if it's a situation where by not inviting him, others will assume you don't consider him an important person, then you do have to invite him. Even though you know he's not going to come, because you're not doing it for him, you're not doing it to mislead him. You're doing it to give him the covered of how others will see, how others will perceive your interaction with him. And that might be the case we're talking about here, that he's going on, please come, please come, please come. The guy says, no, thank you, because he wants people to see that this is somebody important. I would like to have him at my dinner. And the person then eventually, to get away from it, makes a shvuah, absolutely not. And we have this understanding, the machlokes Rambam and Rosh, as to how to use context, and the chidush of the Radvaz, that what the Rambam and the Rosh would both agree is you use context when the context is about the individual who's making the oath, his behavior, what he's doing. It's not just general context, it's the behavioral context of the individual making the shvuah, and that's an idea that we'll use again and again in Masechet Shavuos.